why pathological demand avoidance (in brackets PDA profile of ASD) seems to be another autism scandal awaiting to happen. So by Richard Woods at London South Bank University, PhD student. Um, this is just my conflict of interest kind of statement. This is publicly available information, so I'm just going to skip over this. You can pause the slide if you like. Bit about my perspective and background. So I'm diagnosed autistic in 2012. I do meet a dysphonic PDA profile, but I'm not emotionally attached to it. I'm presently no longer basing my identity on diagnostic categories as much as I can do. I'm equally respecting divergent views and evidence on PDA to critically synthesize appropriate interpretations. My PhD is investigating PDA, and I'm part of the Critical Autism Studies / Disability Studies group at London South Bank University. This is my interpretation of PDA and its literature. Others may disagree. Sometimes I might use medical model-based language in this, but this is because it's in the source material. But I recognise that the social categories described in the kind of psychiatric manuals are social constructs. And it's kind of something I'll be kind of talking about in this talk briefly. So yeah, this is the introduction to this video. I'm aiming for it to be around 20-25 minutes ish, which is slightly longer than I originally liked. But this is the first video in what should be a series of short videos for me. So there should be about 10 of them. I'll talk about that in a moment. So I'm going to briefly talk about PDA features as a series of continuums. Then talk about kind of broader cultural context of PDA profile of autism. Before talking about how PDA profile of ASD is socially constructed, and then kind of like talk about pertinent information like non-autism PDA, and then kind of be concluding with a thought experiment on research investigating non-autism PDA. So yeah, I kind of mentioned this as the first video in a series of that I will be producing. So I'm basically producing it to kind of set out my current thinking on PDA in a cohesive manner and in an accessible manner. So I will be kind of putting the text from the slides up on Twitter before the videos are up, so that way just for ease of accessibility. So yeah, the should most of them should be short for me. So by that, there should be around 15-20 minutes, and I am going to try and do that quite rigidly. So even if they're just kind of introductory overviews. So yeah, this video in itself has kind of three main kind of parts to it, which is kind of some kind of cultural context around PDA as a profile of autism, how it's kind of being kind of socially constructed, and kind of what some pertinent information for kind of like non-autism PDA, then concluding on a thought experiment. So as part of this kind of larger series, the main kind of core of it will be a series of trilogies of videos. So the first trilogy will basically be expanding upon the material in this talk. So the first one will be kind of like how PDA profile of ASD is kind of constructed, like what's kind of ignored in order to do that, kind of implications of kind of culture, kind of implications, kind of background around kind of PDA profile of autism. So the next trilogy is kind of more what am I actually thinking, what PDA is, like what you kind of practically do about it, and kind of contrasting kind of like my approach to PDA with kind of PDA profile of ASD advocates. That's kind of like both kind of like theorizing and kind of like would be in practice. So so I'm trying to kind of put a kind of more practical aspect in this. So in this series, and the kind of the last kind of trilogy is kind of like the other or the rest of them. So it'd be stuff like critiquing the PDA strategies, and that video is kind of already up. There also will be kind of I will put in there like a defense video of PDA profile of autism, so that way I need to provide some balance and some kind of like what the kind of PDA profile autism advocates would likely say in response to my views on PDA. So yeah, and also the only real large video in this series will be a PDA why it's suitable for PDA profile autism to be investigated by BBC Panorama, which is I've got material on Twitter from like 3 or 4 months ago. I just haven't had time to to make the video, because it would take me about 3 or 4 days to do it. So yeah, and I realised that I should probably make a separate video for the thought experiment against it, because there's about 10 to 11 slides worth of material that's relevant, and that's about a 15 minutes video in itself. So so that one I will probably make next before getting on to fleshing out the first trilogy in this series. So yeah, I should aim to produce a video once every 2 to 3 weeks. So it should take it throughout the rest of 2023 to produce this series of videos. So moving on, this is just a brief overview of how I think PDA is conceptualized. So this is basically a series of continuums of PDA features. Left hand side, you got PDA Profile of Autism. Right hand side, you got classic, more straightforward autism. The green arrows are indicating it's not impaired or less impaired, and the red arrows are it's problematic / like highly impaired. So you got a series of continuums like anxiety, avoidance of auditory demands like bullying, harassment, lying, stalking, stealing, fantasy role play, impulsivity, obsessive behaviour, often focusing on other people, a need for control or drive for autonomy, like rapid mood changes, reinforcement based approaches are effective or not effective, kind of social stimulative avoidance behaviour, and kind of like theory of mind deficits or not. You'll notice that most of these highly impaired areas are down the PDA Profile of Autism end, and most of the less impaired stuff's kind of classic, more straightforward. I'd point out there's an alternate way of doing this, which is kind of classic or more straightforward autism is mainly just autism, and the PDA features are features of co-occurring difficulties like ADHD, anxiety, conduct problems, OCD, and trauma features. Please do not verify this diagram. It has some problematic aspects, like saying ABA and PBS are suitable for autistic people. So yeah, more kind of cultural background context for PDA. So some research has kind of indicated that parents of children attributed with PDA or suspected PDA are a kind of a risk group. So it's kind of looking at parental stress and kind of views around kind of PDA as a disability category. Is what that kind of PhD thesis is at. So yeah, moving on. This is a quote from a book by Durivilla and Levy. So, oh, sorry, it should be 2019 there. But yeah, the anxiety levels of parents and children who have PDA patterns of behaviour are higher than those of parents of children with autism conduct disorder. Being calm and positive when you are being challenged by your child's daily avoidance of demands or when dealing with a meltdown is indeed not an easy task. I've included this quote because actually I like it, because we have to be kind of empathetic with the kind of challenges that not only those expressing PDA features have, but also the caregivers and the rest of the family members interacting with them. When you consider the behaviours that are being described in PDA, they will naturally be problematic for most people dealing with them on a consistent basis. So we kind of need to appreciate that the caregivers, the PDA caregivers themselves are a vulnerable group themselves, and would be predicted to be so if one would kind of consider the effects of interacting frequently with someone who has quite intense and extreme and frequent kind of behaviours. That would be anxiety provoking in most people. So yeah, what this kind of means is that caregivers are highly motivated to take part in research. So it kind of matters because we know that interest in the PDA has sharply risen over the last 10 years, and it kind of outstrips its evidence base, but it kind of results in what seems to be quite large scale interaction with kind of surveys and studies and advocacy efforts for it. So there are examples. So the PDA Society over 2 weeks in March 2018 had 1,445 responses to their Being Misunderstood report survey. And around the same time, there was a petition to get PDA to have better awareness of it like UK health professionals, that had a response of 11,188. I was moved to tears when I read the full description for this petition, because it's quite upsetting when you consider the difficulties that the family and the caregivers themselves were facing. So this isn't the full text, but I recommend anyone to go and read it. So a doctor diagnosed my son with PDA. I had a judge order my son to be seen by CAMS to support the psychologist's diagnosis, but they did not commission PDA, so we're stuck in limbo. To the point of social services wanting to put my son in foster care, but luckily it was a judge that saw there was a problem, and now back at the beginning. So, and this kind of goes back to the point of like, we gotta be kind of empathetic and sympathetic to kind of the PDA caregivers, as much as to those being attributed with PDA. So, yeah. The broader context of this is there's obviously a demand for PDA profile of autism, and that some people seem to be kind of supplying services and resources and products into that kind of demand. So there's a market for PDA, and it just seems that some people do seem to be benefiting from the premature hype around PDA profile of autism. So some examples would be National Autistic Society ran a conference on PDA like annually from 2011 to 2019, and samples of their kind of fees range from £90 to 474. I think, from my understanding, the National Society no longer runs its annual conference. I think it's been taken over by the PDA space. It has like an annual PDA summit in like May each year. But this is a quote from Moore 2020. A growing number of private providers have emerged who are willing to offer a diagnosis of autism with a PDA profile, but can cost anywhere between £1,000 and £3,500. And if you actually kind of consider it, like, there just seems to be something to this. So last year, the PDA Society has produced a document which it claims to be clinical guidance of PDA. I think it's a highly biased research report, but they asked, they invited 12 clinicians to contribute their views to produce this document. And if you check the bios on them, 11 out of those 12 are either full-time or part-time involved in private practice. More recently, if you look at the study coming out from Eaton and Weaver, they did 351 assessments over a 2-year time period, and out of those, 111, or just over 30% of those assessments, resulted in a autism PDA attribution. And bear in mind, that's going to be less than the total number of PDA assessments, because they should be kind of ruling out when people don't have PDA when it conforms to their interpretation of it. And then this is again based in a private clinic. And if you consider Phil Christie, who's meant to be the leading PDA profile of autism expert in the world, like kind of succeeding Newson, this is a quote from his bio from the National Society 2019 PDA conference. So, Phil Christie is a consultant child psychologist who now works on an independent basis and with colleagues as part of Autism Associates. Phil was director of children's services for a regional charity, now Autism East Midlands and Brackets, for 30 years until standing down in 2013. So Phil Christie's been based in independent, basic private practice for almost a decade. The point of this is, you wouldn't be kind of seeing these things if they were not at least seen to be financially benefiting from it. And considering that these are often kind of PDA profile of autism experts offering kind of services in PDA profile of autism, it stretches credibility to view them as not benefiting from PDA profile of autism. So, at least in my view anyway, they might disagree. I mean, others might disagree. But yeah. So, it's a bit of an issue when you kind of consider PDA profile of autism itself seems to be kind of a culturally, kind of like socially constructed. So, we know within autism in general at the moment that there's a male bias in its just generally towards males, but this seems to be kind of socially produced. So this is from a systematic review investigating barriers to diagnosing autistic females. So there's a methodological bias resulting from the inclusion of predominantly male samples, as well as the use of clinical tools that are designed to fit how autism presents in males. So there's kind of the stereotype that autism is a boy's disorder, and we know that kind of clinicians' bias can be a barrier to diagnosing autistic women. So, well, just autistic females. We know that males are often many more times likely to be referred than females. When autism features are at comparable kind of levels, females are less likely to be attributed with autism than males. And we know that autistic females are often misdiagnosed later than males, or kind of just misdiagnosed. Um, so yeah, if you kind of consider these kind of axiological and kind of methodological issues around how autism is kind of constructed and diagnosed, you would see a similar process happening with PDA Profile of Autism. So we know that researchers have approached PDA from their expertise in autism. I already question what expertise in autism is, because whenever I look at PDA, I think it's blatantly not autism, but you know. They would also kind of like PDA Profile Autism advocates would say that autism is expanded to include PDA, but this is problematic, but I don't have time to go into the forms and outs of it. But they would say, like, so this is a quote from this PDA Society's document, which it claims is like clinical guidance. So, as a result of this broadening of the way that autism and the autism spectrum are seen, the contributor's views is that PDA is currently best understood as a profile, or in brackets, a cluster of traits on the autism spectrum. And this is kind of reflected in kind of like investigating population prevalence in autistic persons, exploring PDA's profile in suspected autistic persons. That's like the 100 and odd kind of cases of PDA plus autism mentioned earlier, kind of research, to kind of at least initially validating like PDA screening tools and semi-structured interviews. So that's the extreme demand avoidance questionnaire. That's sort of the extreme demand avoidance questionnaire 8, which is a revised one, and the 11 revised PDA DISCO items. So the DISCO is the semi-structured interview for assessing and diagnosing autism produced by the National Autistic Society. So it's also kind of important because like the study that initially validated the 11 revised PDA DISCO items, they assumed PDA was a meaningful autism subgroup, and that a meaningful autism subgroup is seen in less than 30% of the autism population, and they admit that that's an arbitrary value. And it kind of matters when you can kind of because PDA Profile of Autism advocates are saying that it's a rare subgroup, but is that before or after they've decided that, well, they've arbitrarily decided it's seen in less than 30% of autistic people? But kind of need to move on. So again, referring back to this document by the PDA Society, they're saying that within their autism diagnosis, there is a range of terminology for that is used in formulations, including autism with a PDA profile / a pathological demand avoidance profile, a demand avoidance profile, or a profile of demand avoidance, an extreme pervasive demand avoidance. And that's by PDA Society on page 20. The point of this is that they're tying PDA exclusively to autism as a dual autism and PDA diagnosis, which I have many issues with. And I'm going to go and point out some stuff that they basically seem to be ignoring. And this in terms of kind of context, if you consider PDA in non-autistic persons, so kind of non-autism PDA. People have been saying that PDA is seen in non-autistic people for quite some time. And there is some supporting evidence to say this. So, for example, there is an example of someone with PDA who has attachment disorder and scores 1 on the ADOS in a chapter in Izanayon's PhD thesis, and also in her chapter 8 in the chapter 8 of Izanayon's thesis, she has 3 non-autistic persons that are diagnosed with like conduct disorder, off the top of my head, or 23% of that of the people diagnosed with PDA. There's also kind of 1 out of 4 case studies of PDA with epilepsy in Riley et al. Does not meet threshold for autism, so basically they're non-autistic. And there's other examples from like research, like from like masters theses and conference papers and stuff, in terms of so 8 out of 11 child and young person PDA are non-autistic in Course-Cattell, page 8, and like 7 out of 24, so that's like 29% of children with PDA are non-autistic in McFadden. There is other evidence. So there's like there are like cases in like the initial validation study of Disco, one of the people meeting threshold for PDA does not meet threshold for autism. And there's like a case study with ADHD and personality disorder, which seems not to be non-autistic as well. This is just off the top of my head. But there is actually more, which I'll go on to actually next. So yeah, I'm going to just briefly mention this other example of well, it's probably non-autistic PDA. So if you look at the original initial validation study for the extreme demand avoidance questionnaire, it contains a group of 50 diagnosed children and young person with PDA, but is unknown if these individuals had an autism diagnosis. But this is done before the time where the dual autism ADHD diagnosis was mainly diagnosed or kind of commonly diagnosed. And that matters because we know that there's huge variation in clinical practice in PDA now, but also back then. And that many of those people with PDA basically didn't meet threshold for autism. And there does seem to be something to this because of the bottom quote here. So, Train 2016 is a large-scale survey of autism caregivers, examples of the autism diagnostic process. So there's like 1,047 responses. There's only 5 cases of PDA as a dual diagnosis with autism. It's also interesting because they excluded some cases of PDA which is done as a primary diagnosis. We don't have figures for that because it's not in the data set, and I know this because I asked Laura Crane. So we just know that they said that they had some people who had a primary diagnosis of PDA, and they viewed it that study viewed PDA as a co-occurring difficulty. So they were excluded. I'm going to go back onto other examples of PDA being diagnosed as a standalone category. So we've got the obvious one of the 150 cases in Newson's PDA database, but it is actually at least 150 because they excluded cases which had autism features from their database. But there's also around 100 out of the 375 caregiver reported PDA diagnoses in the Being Misunderstood report by the PDA Society. There's also, if you look at the PDA literature, there's at least 4 out of the 22 PDA diagnoses from Langston and Fredrickson's 2 studies, which are standalone PDA diagnoses. And more recently, if you look at a bunch of case studies in PDA, a lot of them are diagnosed as standalone entities. So that's Carlisle, 2001, Easton Banton, Harvey, Jones, there's single case studies, there's 4 case studies in Riley et al. And Trund et al. 1. I do need to point out that the Easton Banting and the Trund et al. Viewed PDA to be a form of autism, but they're diagnosed as a standalone thing. So, yeah, the point of this is that it does seem possible to diagnose PDA as a standalone category. So there's also debates around if PDA represents autism features or other features than autism, or autism and co-occurring difficulties. So, for example, Wing et al. Suggested that PDA behaviours may not be caused by autism, so there might be a double hit. And there is some evidence to suggest this, such as a couple of studies suggesting that PDA is predicted by features are predicted by hyperactivity and conduct problems, and also kind of anxiety as well. Some studies have kind of suggested that PDA is autism plus co-occurring difficulties. So, Anita et al. 2014b suggested it's a triple hit of autism, conduct problems, and anxiety. And like White et al. Suggested that both autistic traits and anxiety are unique and equally important predictors of demand avoidance. I would point out, basic logic tells you if that PDA represents more than autism, it can't be autism because it cannot be something is more than. This is basically like A plus B plus C does not equal A. And there's another study which didn't really look at anything else other than anxiety, but it's just a point out that I'm trying to say that that anxiety seems to kind of be an important factor or causal mechanism with PDA. So, support for the notion that anxiety and intolerance of uncertainty continue to play a role in the maintenance of PDA behaviours in adulthood. So that's from Johnson and Saunders. It's from the abstract. Um, so basically, you can use this information and other studies to predict what kind of features you'd expect PDA to present in non-autistic people. So, and I'm into the end of the talk, because this is the kind of final thing before the final thought experiment. So, if one looks at PDA descriptions over time, they will notice that they've changed away, and it matters because the literature acknowledges that Leeson's PDA is problematic, assuming it's autism. It has a bunch of features that are not associated with autism, but it has changed to become autism-like. This is something which I kind of would like to go into more detail on in a separate video for the thought experiment. But I kind of explain it in a book chapter that I had published about 9 months ago. So, yeah, if you look at the PDA literature, most of the predicted PDA populations are based on Leeson's PDA clinical descriptions, which is problematic when you consider that recent PDA descriptions have changed to become autism-like. And it's also compounded by the fact that we know that co-occurring difficulties tend to present differently in autistic persons versus non-autistic people, which means that PDA is likely to present differently out in non-autistic persons versus autistic people, which means that you cannot directly use autism-based PDA understandings to indicate if PDA is present in non-autistic populations and how non-autism PDA might look like. Because if you're expecting non-autistic PDAs to look autistic, meet the threshold for being autistic, you're probably barking up the wrong tree. It just seems contradictory and nonsensical, at least to me anyway. I mean, other people might disagree on that one. I'm getting on to kind of conclusions. I'm going to end on a thought experiment to kind of think about what non-autism PDA might look like and what evidence base might be suitable. So the setting for it is an inpatient unit, and the kind of questionnaires used are the Extreme Demand Avoidance questionnaire for adults, the Full Autism Quotient, the GAD-7, and a PHQ-9, so that's an anxiety screen, depression screen, and the Strength of Difficulties questionnaire. And most of the final four tools are quite commonly used in research and clinical practice, from my understanding. And for semi-structured interview for PDA, use the 11 revised PDA disco items. I'd point out they're not designed to be used outside of autism, but there is a scoring mechanism for them, and they are open access. So they can just be used as one wants, even though I think NAS would be probably uncomfortable, but you know. But yeah. So the quantitative results would be that the PDA features predicted by conduct problems, hyperactivity, anxiety, but not autistic traits. And the qualitative problems is that these 20 non-autistics who score high on the Extreme Demand Avoidance questionnaire and the 11 revised PDA disco questions, they are presenting kind of demand avoidance, socially manipulative avoidance behaviours, rapid mood changes, impulsivity, lack of their own identity, various criminal and problematic behaviours. So, would these two studies indicate cases of non-autistic PDA, and why? And that's basically that's basically it, really. These are my contact details and resource information. So my email, Twitter handle, ResearchGate's link, YouTube channel, which you should already have. And these are the references. There's 5 reference slides. I'm not gonna linger on them long because you can pause the video to access them. So this is the second reference slide. It's been a bit depressing kind of preparing this video, as I said earlier, because it's quite unpleasant to kind of think about what I'm actually saying when I'm actually saying it. Because I mean, who wants another autism scandal? I don't. I'm
pretty fed up of them. I think autistic people should be treated better than they are, but we are where we are with it. So yeah, this is the last reference slide. So I hope you found it useful, and I hope you look out for future videos in this short series of mine.